Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're listening to this. I'm your host, Leafy Potato, and welcome to the second episode of the Joy of NRTS podcast. On today's episode, I would like to talk about simple and effective unit compositions for late game. Mainly talking about what I think the most important units you should have in your late game are. Right? What are they? Why are they important? And going on to other units that you can consider mixing in and where their strengths lie. Right? And that should help you sort of formulate your own ideas about what the right units are for your choice. Right? Everyone plays a little bit differently. Even using the same units, some players will lean on different units for their strengths in different ways, and so they'll play differently. I've seen it myself in the reliance on some players on choppers primarily, where they use their tanks as support, and I've seen people use tanks primarily with choppers as support, but we'll get to that in a second. If you're wondering how these work, I have a doc in front of me. It's not scripted necessarily. I've just got bullet points that I want to talk about. I might have like a sentence or two that I wrote up about the topic, but for the most part, I'm going to go and add some flourish, though this first section I have written a lot on. And at the end of the episode, I will go over some builds that connect the early game to the late game, because at some point I'll have to talk about the topic of how do we actually get to late game, because that's the goal, right? We want to get to late game, we want to play a game. We need to get there, because you can die anytime between when the game starts and, well, the end of the match. Ideally, the end of the match isn't you dying, but I digress. That's for a different episode, probably next week's. Starting off, I've got the late game troop compositions, or just the late game troops in general. I've separated them out into essentials, as in what pretty much every serious player needs to have in their late game in some number, and then slightly less essential but still relevant. The stuff that you need to know what it does, you need to know why it's important. You won't necessarily see these guys every single late game, and you certainly won't see every player using them every single late game, but they are still powerful, and they should be considered when you are thinking about your late game compositions. Okay, so first off, arguably the best unit in the game, workers. They build everything. I think that says enough, but I will say more anyways. Workers allow you to... Well, first off, they allow you to get to late game. That's pretty important. You need to be able to build housing so that you can fill your army. You need to be able to build unit-producing structures so that you can make your army. You need to be able to build static defenses so that you don't need to rely solely on your army for your command center's protection, because you do need to protect your command center even when you're trying to attack the opponent. You need them to build farms as you are taking more territory in order to bolster your economy, to give you the money you need to build more units. Basically, everything in the game is going to, at some point, involve a worker. And so workers, you might only have the two that you started with for your late game. I'd recommend making a couple more than that, but still. Workers, you're going to see them. They're very important. If you can strike at your enemy's workers, you can find a lot of value in stopping their forward progress, especially if it's in a very long, drawn-out game that's defined by artillery, but we'll get there. Okay, next up, medics. Healing in NRTS, generally speaking, is extremely valuable. There's a couple of reasons why. First off, being able to take a unit... There's no auto-healing, right? Being able to take a unit that has received battle damage, which they do whenever you get into range of an enemy unit, since the ranges involved in NRTS are almost all exactly equal, right? Militia and recons and heavy troopers and choppers have the same range. So whenever one's in range of another, they're both shooting. They're exchanging fire, right? So you deal damage, you take damage. What healing allows you to do is undo the damage you've taken, allowing your damage to stick, right? So healing, very important. Also, in NRTS, relative to other RTS games, a single unit takes much longer to produce in terms of both eco and just build time, but a single unit in NRTS takes a while to replace. Even when you're at late game, if you manage to get yourself to 500 eco, that's like really, really solid, and even so, that only allows you to build It doesn't even allow you to build 3 heavy tanks in a minute. So you need to be very careful with your money, and you need to be very careful with your army, therefore. And so being able to heal off damage instead of sending damaged units into a battle that they will ultimately die in, right? Healing off the damaged units, extremely valuable. Medics happen to be the most accessible source of healing. They're the most expandable source of healing, and while you should be placing 3 hospitals in every single game that you make, adding medics allows you to heal even more than that, and importantly, also allows you to heal without needing to sell and rebuy your hospitals where your army is, right? Wherever you're moving, you've got healing going, and that can allow you to stay in a fight and heal during a fight without being stuck in one place. So very important. Medics, extremely powerful. You're going to see them pretty much every serious late game that you play. Okay, let me take a sip of my drink real quick, because my voice is shot from today. Forgive me. Alright, choppers, next up. Pretty much everybody expects this. If workers aren't the best unit in the game, choppers are like the next in consideration. For one, they don't fear the otherwise strongest unit in the game, being heavy tanks, which we will get to those as well. We're going to get to a lot of units. I keep saying that phrase, but they don't fear heavy tanks, right? Tanks can't hit choppers. They don't shoot up. That's great for choppers. Also, you'll notice, so far, workers don't shoot back at all. Medics don't shoot back at all. So, we've mentioned... Well, actually, yeah, we've mentioned artillery as well. And artillery doesn't really shoot at choppers either. So, choppers have... Basically, they've got an open buffet table of very important, critical late-game units that they can shoot at for free. Now, you could argue that workers make that difficult because they build static defenses, and then your towers are shooting at enemy choppers, and, you know, maybe that's one way that workers aren't as free of a target, but the idea is still there. The very important, necessary for winning units all struggle with choppers, therefore choppers are good. In fact, they are... That's the argument for them being the best unit in the game, is the other best units in the game get completely owned by choppers, and so everything has to sort of consider choppers, or else you lose. Okay. Now, they do have a couple of weaknesses, namely static defenses, but we'll get there. The other strengths of the choppers, even if it weren't for them just being able to shoot at the important units for free, they are the fastest thing in the game, tied with a jeep, but they can also fly, allowing them to go over terrain and access routes on the map that just aren't accessible to any other unit. They can float over obstacles as well. They can just fly straight over a wall if for whatever reason your opponent decides to make a wall with their towers. Choppers just don't care. They can also fly over enemy formations, which is important, right? Units have collision in NRTS, but choppers being able to fly over enemy formations can allow them to take the shortest route to their base, perhaps, if their base is relatively undefended, or in the attempt of nuking the opponent, you can just fly straight over the opponent, gun for their base. It's going to be at like 20% HP, and then choppers can fly over the base and pick that off. So very, very useful. You can use them in a lot of different ways. They are extremely good at exploiting offensive windows of opportunity. Right? You find a weakness in your opponent's defenses. Choppers are the thing to exploit it. Okay. So, I will mention lacking choppers in your late game composition. Very good way to let your opponent back into the game if you aren't careful. These other units, okay, you're going to need workers, period. Medics, you can go without medics. It's not advisable unless you have a really good thing to be using that other pop on, because you're going to be stuck to hospitals. Not making choppers in the late game, or lacking good chopper counts in the late game, you can find yourself being completely outmaneuvered, and so your opponents start setting the pace of the battle. The only time that you could really justify lacking in chopper production is if you've just got that good of a threat on your opponent and also adequate anti-air to prevent their choppers from getting anything done, and so you've just have pop spent on something better. Very rare. I would recommend to all beginners, intermediates, even the advanced players, just make choppers. just make choppers. Makes your life easier, makes the game simpler to play. They're considered to be the best for a pretty good reason. Okay, next up, heavy tanks. A couple of things that make this unit mandatory for late game. Okay, highest single target damage in the game. That's great, that's awesome. All of you also know they don't just deal single target damage, they have AoE. In fact, they're one of the few units in the game that does deal AoE damage. And it does its single target damage in full to every unit in radius. Anyone who is shot at a militia formation knows this. You can one-shot dozens of militia with a single shot. In fact, not just militia, they do just one-shot militia, but they two-shot most forms of infantry. They two-shot soldiers, they two-shot workers, they two-shot medics, they two-shot repairmen, right? They two-shot so many of the infantry or infantry-esque class that it's kind of ridiculous. Basically, anything that isn't a vehicle is going to be taking massive damage from heavy tanks, and everything that is a vehicle is going to also be taking massive damage from heavy tanks. They just have more HP, so they can sort of shrug it off. Sort of. Recons get 3-shot by heavy tanks, so it's basically a tier 1 Punisher, right? It's the ultimate 1-up unit. I get heavy tanks, I can fight way more tier 1 units with my single tier 2 unit than you can imagine, and if I can start massing heavy tanks, which you will be in the late game, tier 1 units start to phase out of their viability. Heavy tanks are ultimately your main source of offensive pressure, and if they could shoot at choppers, they'd be the best unit in the game, and there'd be no question whatsoever. They can't shoot at choppers is their main problem, and so you now have a massive source of damage that is extremely expensive that you want to keep on the field because it's it's your major source of damage output, but it has a clear weakness, and so you need to shape your strategy around keeping your heavy tanks on the field, able to fire, and not dying to choppers. Okay. Also, another thing, heavy tank, because it has splash damage, does allow you to punish lazy formations from your opponents, right? If they're just having all their units in a ball, heavy tanks allow you to much, much more violently destroy your enemy's hopes and dreams, and so it forces your opponent to spend more attention micromanaging their army, and it gives you another way to strike at your opponent by striking at their mental capacity to act. So, yeah, there's that. You can score mental victories with heavy tanks. And it's one of the very few units that you can fight an enemy with less of the same unit and still get a desirable outcome. Some of that comes down to the presence of healing, right? When you have medics on both sides, having less heavy tanks means that there's less units to be affected by splash, and having more heavy tanks, generally speaking, means it's harder to keep them all firing while also not being affected by splash damage. So I have seen 6 heavy tanks hold off like 10, 11, 12 when both sides had the same amount of medics, and it's not even like the 10, 11, 12 struggle to push forward. So yeah, just something to notice. You do still have to be very careful with them, but once you get to like 6, I think 6 is a really good number. 6 heavy tanks with healing support can hold ground better than pretty much anything else. Okay, on to the next unit, and the final mandatory unit, artillery. I don't think there's much discussion here. If your opponents are playing with their heads screwed onto their shoulders correctly, artillery is mandatory to beat down your opponent, right? What it does is, for one, it can shoot at turrets and missile turrets for free. That's great. It cannot shoot at towers for free, but the artillery has the exact same range as a tower, which means that it can guarantee that it at most fights one tower at a time with patience, right? So if you're microing your artillery using the stop commands to inch forward, you can make it so that each one of your artillery only ever has to fire at one tower. When you pair your artillery with some sort of healing, that means, provided you have enough healing, you can destroy infinite amounts of towers, and your opponent is suddenly on a timer. any and all of their defenses will be whittled down with time, and eventually there's no more defenses, base is undefended, you win. You could just strike down your opponent's base with artillery if you really wanted to. It allows you, in a way that doesn't lose you your entire army, to deal with opponent's static defense. And so artillery shapes the pace of late game. In a heavily static defense ridden late game, so a correctly played late game, in my opinion, the artillery is your form of movement. Without artillery, you don't have any. Adding 1 or 2 artillery to your artillery battery also speeds up the rate at which you can destroy towers, and so you sort of have this push-pull where if you're spending population on artillery, you're allowed to move a little bit faster, but then you have a little bit less in tanks, and so you need to be on top of your micro if you want to be able to protect yourself. Also, you give your opponent some more targets, but we can talk about that in a different episode. In any case, artillery, being able to shoot at towers and missile turrets, turrets and missile turrets for free, towers once they have healing, any other building that's exposed that isn't behind a tower for free, already make them very important. The fact that they have splash damage on top of that just makes things nicer. Potentially able to hit units that are camping near static defenses. Very, very nice. It's my personal favorite unit, and if I had to define some sort of center of gravity in military parlance to an NRTS late game comp, it's artillery. Without the artillery, you can't move. Okay. So now, those 5, workers, medics, choppers, heavy tanks, artillery, are what I consider late game essentials. Not making them is generally very ill-advised. Now, next, we have slightly less essential, but still relevant units. Not necessarily in any particular order, but it just so happens that they're mostly in the order I'd consider them next relevant. The 5 units that I mentioned as late game essentials aren't listed in order of relevance because they're all pretty much mandatory, though I suppose medics are a little bit less than the rest. But continuing on, the next unit that I would consider as not quite essential, but definitely worth consideration, and a lot of people I can already imagine are going to disagree with me on this, anti-air. And I'll probably have to go into my own episode to explain why I believe anti-air aren't essential, but I do absolutely see their value. Okay. Anti-air are as valuable as they are in NRTS simply because choppers are dominant in late game. Right? Choppers can shoot at every other majorly relevant late game unit for free. Anti-air give you a unit who's specifically designed to help you protect your late game units. From choppers, that is. From choppers. Okay. Additionally, the circumstances of late game play to the anti-air strength just a little bit. Choppers have a high mobility, but they are less able to use that in late game because it's riddled with static defenses and choked up to all heavens. They're less able to use their mobility than they would be in the earlier game, right? I'm sure plenty of people have had the experience of making an anti-air on reaction to an opponent's chopper and finding out the hard way that anti-air is pretty bad at anti-ing air. It's not exactly a fun lesson to learn, that's for sure. But in late game, anti-air don't have to worry so much about that because you can constrain the chopper's movement. And also, anti-air works best when choppers have to fight into them, which reads as, when there is a credible threat defended by anti-air attacking the opponent's base, artillery makes for a pretty good credible threat, and so anti-air just so happens to benefit greatly from the circumstances of late game meta. It's not that anti-air itself is crazy, because honestly it's not. It's arguably overpriced, but because everything in late game sort of shapes up to choppers being really important, artillery being the main ultimate threat that must be stopped at all costs, anti-air find themselves with a very valuable niche. Couple problems. Anti-air generally needs to be masked to be effective. One anti-air is not going to stop 12 choppers. In fact, it won't even stop 6. Unless the 6 choppers are just all damaged and not doing much of anything. So, you need a lot of anti-air. Another problem with them, they can only shoot air units. Meaning that if there aren't any choppers for some reason, sure, anti-air prevents the opponent from wanting to make choppers, but now you've got a whole bunch of population spent doing nothing, and you only have 110 to work with, which sounds like a lot until you start putting a whole lot of vehicles on the map, and especially once you start putting medics on the map, as medics are 2 pop. Right, if you got 20 medics with your comp, that's 40 population. If you decide that you want to add in 6 anti-air, that's another 12 population that could have been tanks. So, or artillery for that matter, or choppers, right? Anti-air and choppers taking up the same population. Very worth consideration. Anti-air, additionally, they suck into tanks. Absolutely suck into tanks because you need to mass them. They are just, they're splash magnets, basically. You want them to be close enough to the front lines so that they can protect your tanks from enemy choppers, but if they're close to the front lines, they are within splash range, which means that you can take a lot more damage and have anti-air soaking up medic healing that needs to be going to tanks. So, not mandatory, but strengths are still very valid. The fact alone that it is great at shooting at choppers makes anti-air worth consideration for your late game comp, and you'll see a very high percentage of your games involve anti-air in late game. Again, I think it's not essential. You can protect your army from enemy choppers pretty simply with your own choppers, though you might struggle to fight the enemy army when it's got anti-air and whatnot. But then you get into a whole thing where, like, if they've got choppers and anti-air and that's what you're threatened by, the choppers can only really move as fast as their anti-air because now they've spent population and anti-chopper measures, and so they're probably going to have their air force moving at slower than chopper speed, which then allows you to outmaneuver them with yours, and so you get into a whole mess. It's just a whole mess. Generally speaking, though, you can fight chopper anti-air with choppers. You just have to be very careful with them. And also, use your tanks to shoot the anti-air first, but I digress. Need to move on. Fighters. Okay, so what fighters give you... Fighter strengths are pretty much the same as the anti-air. They come at an extra cost, though, and so one might at first wonder, why would I spend an extra $14 on a fighter and also need an upgraded air pad and or a carrier in order to make them when I could just make an anti-air? Well, for one, they fly, and that's the biggest thing. Because fighters fly, they are not susceptible to tank splash, which makes choppers trying to deal with fighters a whole lot more difficult. Right? You don't have as many tools at your disposal to deal with fighters in that case. Okay, great, awesome, groovy, grand, and other G words that mean cool. So we dodge tanks, and that's big because tanks are everywhere, and we fight choppers, which is great. Still aren't faster than choppers, but the late game conditions that make anti-air valuable also make fighters valuable. Okay, there is a couple more downsides than just the higher price and the research requirement, though. For one, anti-air. Anti-air is weak to tanks. Fighters are weak to anti-air. So if your composition is relying on choppers and anti-air, which if you're making anti-air, you probably should also have choppers so that you can exploit if the opponent doesn't have an air force anymore by being able to shoot at their tanks for next to free. But if you're trying to combine choppers and anti-air, and your choice of anti-air is fighters, then both of them get shot at by enemy anti-air, and that's pretty lame. So fighters, very susceptible to anti-air. At least anti-air doesn't have splash damage, so it's not like you're going to be losing in one volatile blast, or a couple volatile blasts rather, but you're not going to be losing or getting your anti-air reduced in capability to a couple of lucky misses because your anti-air flies. So there's that. There is another weakness that I could point out, in that fighters and choppers by extension, because they're flying, if you have them in formation with your units, they block your units, and so it's harder to double click on your stuff. If you have a mainly ground force and your anti-air is protecting your tanks and is close to your tanks and it's on the ground, at least your tanks and your anti-air can be clicked separately. Sometimes fighters can make it difficult to actually click on your units, and I know that that's a very small nitpick, but I've definitely been in situations where I have mismicroed because I clicked on a fighter and not on tank when I was trying to select my whole tank line by double clicking. So there's that. Okay. So, fighters and anti-air both achieve mostly the same thing. Fighters are more expensive, but you don't have to deal with tanks. Anti-air is cheaper, more available, does have to deal with tanks. Anti-air also helps balance out fighters a little bit by being able to shoot at them for free. Anti-air and fighters, you'll see, will kind of oscillate back and forth in terms of usage. Anti-air gets better the more fighters there are, and fighters can kind of stand on their own the more people don't like getting their anti-air splashed by tanks. So there's that. Why I consider them to be less viable than choppers, less essential than choppers, is primarily they're both defensive. They're extremely defensive in nature, and choppers are your easiest tool to exploit offensive gaps. You can't do that with fighters, and you can't do that with anti-air. And you might say, well, you can have choppers too, sure, but the idea is you have to cut your pop at some point, and you're probably going to be cutting choppers in order to be making anti-air in order to fight the enemy's choppers. You lessen your own ability to exploit offensive gaps, and what you receive in return for that is a defensive, completely defensive capability that can be filled in some regards by static defense. So anti-air for sure, very, very valuable because choppers are valuable, but their defensive nature in combination with both of their clear weaknesses make them not an automatic include on your compositions. Okay, so next unit on the list is significantly less viable, but you'll still see it have a place. So Hornets. You don't really see Hornets that often. I think that's a bit of a shame. They definitely have a place in late game, but it's only in late game versus something like a chopper, which you can make at any point in the game. You're only really going to see Hornets when you're basically at max and you're trying to craft your perfect army composition. The strength of the Hornets, if you are unaware, it doubles down on the strength of the choppers. It does not fight tanks and shoots at them for free. It just so happens to have 2 guns, which means that it shoots twice as fast, does the same damage as choppers. It's just your 2 population does double the damage for an extra $20. Awesome. Cool. It also shoots at workers, it shoots at medics, it shoots at artillery, the stuff that you'd expect. It's basically just a chopper in its ground attack role made better in terms of damage. Couple downsides. Big downsides. For one, Hornets don't shoot air units. You'll notice that's a pretty big problem considering one of the major essential units is a chopper. And there are choppers everywhere in NRTS. So Hornets are sitting ducks against choppers. That's bad. They're also slower than choppers, which means that if they ever have to retreat to friendly units, they don't have very long before choppers are on them. And if choppers get on them, you're losing your Hornets. It doesn't help as well that Hornets have less HP than choppers, but that's really the least of their worries. They do require an upgraded air pad. They do require an aircraft carrier. That limits their usefulness very much so. But if you're trying to just squeeze value out of your air units in the deal as much extra DPS to tanks as possible in order to destroy them more quickly or to overload the enemy's medics or what have you, Hornets do fill that niche better than choppers do. They do, however, require anti-chopper measures and cannot in themselves function to counter enemy choppers, right? Your own choppers can fight enemy choppers just fine. Your own Hornets cannot, and so you either need fighters or anti-air, or you need to rely on your static defenses, which you can't do in an offensive measure, but you can do in a defensive measure when you're trying to use Hornets defensively. Not recommended. Don't try that. But if you had to, you can. Ultimately, can be useful only in situations where you're already committing to having a decent anti-chopper ball and want to also have a strong ground attack roll. They're very fragile. You had to be extremely careful with them. Okay, next up, light tanks. And some of you might be very curious. I'll just read what I have written down here. While heavy tanks can and do swing matches, light tanks have a valuable niche. Light tanks do not deal AoE damage, but their single target damage is about the same and HP identical to heavy tanks for just over half the price. In a well-microed and maintained army, light tanks serve to fill your population with good enough firepower and HP, allowing you to hit max pop sooner than your opponent and put them in a bind. Light tanks also do trade cost efficiently into heavy tanks if you can dodge all the splash damage, but that gets very difficult very quickly when units are massed. So, TLDR, light tanks are cheaper than heavy tanks, their single target DPS is basically the same, their HP is the same, and so what light tanks allow you to do, if you are fighting an opponent who is microing well, and you yourself are microing well, is basically cheat your way to max quicker by spending, $75 less per unit to get tanks, and then just push with your tanks. Right, you still want to have adequate healing. You still need to have your head screwed onto your shoulders correctly if you want to be playing in a late game. But yeah, light tanks. It's like having lemonade and then pouring water into it. You have good enough lemonade and a little bit more of it. If you put too much water into it, you stop having lemonade and it sucks. But you can have something that's basically lemonade and have it quicker. Okay, next unit up, Repairman. He's valuable in a similar way to how medics are, except he only heals buildings. That's really great for if you're trying to annoy an artillery player. Mainly if you are already good at repelling artillery. It's not meant that your repairmen are healing off damage as an artillery is continuously shooting at you. They're there to heal off whatever damage they can in the time that they get when your army pushes the enemy artillery away from you. The enemy artillery really should only be shooting at you if you have to retreat to a hospital in order to heal your army back to full. Otherwise, you should be in a sort of position where both you and your opponent are in a dead zone, not able to shell at the other. In that situation, Repairmen can allow you to not have to constantly rebuild towers, especially if you're upgrading your towers so that they have a little bit more staying power. They can find some niche. Their biggest problem is their population cost of 2. It's really obnoxious. You fill your population with Repairmen quite quickly. But they also can be valuable in healing your command center, because you only get one of those, you can't ever rebuild it. The command center is the ultimate goal of the game. If your opponent destroys, or if you destroy all of your opponent's command centers, you win. Likewise, the inverse is true. If your opponent destroys all of their opponent's command centers, they win. So if your opponent manages to fail a CC dive or attempts a nuke on your base and you're left with some sliver of HP on your command center, Repairmen, by default, become useful. So there's that. Okay, next up, Juggernauts. They're not relevant in terms of their fighting capability. They can fight. You really don't want to fight with them. You can if you have to. What Juggernauts allow you to do, once you're done maxing on your housing, once you're done, farming is going to be difficult. Farm upgrades are already done. Juggernauts allow you to trade 3 pop for $10 per minute, with no other restriction. The efficiency of Juggernaut fishing is terrible relative to your other options, but your other options are generally much more limited. Juggernauts are scalable. Now, The tricky thing is, because they eat into your population and they eat into it very quickly, while juggernauts do allow you to scale your economy, you do not want to be scaling it super hard. So you have to exercise a great deal of restraint, know how many juggernauts you are willing to make. Every juggernaut is a tank you don't have on the front lines. If you put it that way, I think it becomes a little bit more clear how you have to start playing your position. But in exchange, you have a slightly higher economy. You start sacrificing too many tanks on the front lines, you start having a very bad time. But provided you have enough to hold your ground, having the extra money per minute can give you the edge if you're, for whatever reason, in a nuke race. Not in the sort of nuke race that you see in most public lobbies where somebody will do nothing except save for their nuke, but in the kind of nuke race where you and your opponent are both making an army, and then whoever floats enough money first makes a nuke silo, makes a nuke missile, launches it. In that sort of drawn-out game, where usually you end up in like the 50-minute mark, having an extra $50 a minute uncontested is pretty important. Just saying. Okay, next up. Destroyers. They are actually the best unit in the game. The trick is they're locked to the water. On Valera, they are just the best. Period. If you could snap your fingers and have only one unit, you'd probably just want it to be destroyers. They're great, they're awesome. They have 3 tank cannons that can shoot at the heavens, and 2 artillery cannons that can shoot at units. These guys are actually just insane in naval games. They are also pretty much mandatory for sea escorts. Sea escorts without destroyers are what we in the know call prayers. Just thought you'd know that. Okay, next up, Transport Copter. This is the last one I've got on my list of particularly relevant units. There are others, like you could say Transport Boat, Barge, Aircraft Carrier, but I think those are sort of self-explanatory. You sort of need them in some capacity. Transport Copter simply allows your medics and workers not to be shot at by tanks, and also gives them a mobility boost. You spend 1 population and you can lift, I believe it's 10 units. I should know this by heart. But considering that both medics and workers die to 2 tank shots, avoiding that being a possibility is great. Of course, you trade it for a weakness to anti-air specifically. But overall, I'd say it's a net positive. If you want to sacrifice the population and spend the $45, you'll get some value out of it. Okay, so those are my thoughts on the different units and also their viabilities in late game. If you have any disagreements with me, I very much encourage you to go ahead and drop a comment about what you think is wrong with my ideas, specifically probably why anti-air needs to be mentioned, and also Mister's going to be mad that I didn't mention heavy troopers, but I'm not sorry. Okay, before we round this out, I've got 2 builds from early to late game that I'd like to share, and these are just general guidelines. They're not specific builds. I'm not going to detail like, oh, at this time you make this structure and then you queue this unit, and then at this time, no, it's just very general speaking. Okay, so first off, this is the one that I'm going to recommend to basically everybody who picks up the game. It is very simple, it is very easy. It keeps you alive in the beginning of the game, gives you something to do in the middle of the game, and then transitions you very cleanly into the late game using units that are mandatory. Okay, so first off, militia, into chopper, into up to depot. I think that's kind of explanatory. So in the late game section, we didn't touch on militia at all. That's because the presence of heavy tanks pretty much invalidates them. But militia are a wonderful tool to A, not die in the beginning of the game, and B, allow you to interact with the beginning of the game in any meaningful way, as well as provide you with a general purpose army for the middle of the game. They're just cheap, they're cost efficient, they're great. So they also build out of your command center, which gives your command center something to do, so that's cool. Keep your command center employed. The idea here is we're going to make militia as our main army force while we go and take farms with our workers. we're going to make houses to allow us to build more militia. Once we have 4 houses, we'll probably need to make a generator first, but we will then make an air pad, and then we will begin chopper production. Now, I'll touch on how many choppers you want here in a bit, but next, we continue our housing, building militia or choppers as we please, and then once our housing is done, we make a vehicle depot, and then we immediately upgrade it. Okay, so, a couple things to note. First off, you're going to want to be making choppers throughout the mid-game to give yourself an air force that allows you to switch into a ground army. So the idea here is we're going to get the air force first, because choppers can shoot at all of the up to vehicles for free. Use our air force to fight the enemy air force to keep them off of our up to vehicles, and then get the up to vehicles to where they can fight, right? We want our tanks and our artillery ready to go. First note, switching to full chopper production too early can stunt your eco and blunt your offense. If you immediately after 4 houses have something like, I don't know, 130 eco, you can't make much more than 2 choppers in a minute, which is not nothing, but it could be more worthwhile to you to continue your militia production, continue your housing, and then make a chopper when you float some money, allowing you to continue to increase your economy, continue to produce militia, which allow you to fight enemy militia, and generally just get yourself on a better footing in the mid-game. Making full chopper production once your air pad is down basically elongates the mid-game and makes it very chopper reliant. Of course, when you have more choppers on the field, you're going to be more tank resistant and you're going to be more weak to anti-air. Ideally, you don't want to give your opponent a reason to be making anti-air until the late game, where then they have to mass it, which gives you a good target for your heavy tank. So just keep that in mind. Full chopper production on 4 houses is probably not a good idea, but as you get closer and closer to max, you can start going to full chopper production, especially once you hit the 192 eco mark. That's when you can just produce 3 choppers a minute, which is the full amount that you can produce out of an air pad. And then life is pretty good for you. And by the time that you have 192 eco as well, you should probably be hitting the point where making extra militia just won't do much for you, because the enemy's going to have heavy tanks soon. Okay. Point of note, first unit out of the up to depot should almost always be a heavy tank. Artillery are useful. Militia chopper, though, struggles to deal with enemy ground units in a sustainable way. You pretty much need healing if you're ever going to deal with anti-air. And also, while choppers can take okay-ish fights against small numbers of militia, they can't really stop a general push. So if your opponent happens to get like 40, 45 militia for whatever reason, and decides that they want to try to kill you with their militia, and you've just got a ball of choppers, you can dent their militia ball, but you'll lose your air force, and the air force is way more expensive. So your choppers can like poke at their militia, but that's kind of hard to do, especially if they've got anti-air as well. So like militia anti-air of all things can start giving you trouble. So punish that, make a heavy tank out of that depot first. Now, the only situation which you should really consider artillery first is if you've already got towers set up right in front of an enemy command center and they're kind of choked off, and also they have exposed buildings that you can fire at without needing healing. In this case as well, I will note that the following point will be a bit different. If you do find yourself in a situation where you can freely shoot artillery into your opponent's base, you don't have to make a hospital before you, or like while your depot's upgrading. In fact, you'd probably rather just have the $160 to queue an artillery and then immediately start like a tank and then another tank, and then you can pick up the hospital whenever, but I digress. Next off, hospitals will be important in any late game comp. That is true. The first hospital here should be made as your depot is upgrading at latest. Again, minus that exception. There's always exceptions. No matter what I'm saying, there's an exception. If at any point you have more than 5 choppers hanging at half HP or lower, just go ahead and drop the hospital early, as it can already pay itself off in immediate chopper repairs. So 5 half HP choppers. Choppers are worth $64 each, $32 per half a chopper, right? You get to 160. Very simple math, decent to remember. If you've got 5 choppers and they're all damaged, just go ahead and save that $160 and drop the hospital. Just make your life easier. And then you can also use the hospital going forward. But if for whatever reason you don't get to that point earlier, maybe you're just really passive with your choppers, or maybe you're just goated and you never took a single bit of damage. After you upgrade that vehicle depot, you should have like 200 something eco anyways. Drop the hospital and then start saving for your first heavy tank. As for this build, it's pretty simple. Overall, you don't really have to remember that many things. After your 4th house, drop an air pad. After your 20th house, drop a depot, upgrade, hospital, tank. And overall, it's pretty easy to use. The militia really are there to just keep you from dying from cheese or hyper-aggressive militia play, because there's not very much that's good into that. There are ways that you can beat militia aggression without militia, but they're generally very micro-intensive and extremely difficult. But as for newer players, militia is just going to be the simplest answer for that. And then you get into a chopper sometime around the 5.5 minute mark, 6 minute mark, which is soon enough that your opponent won't have static defense everywhere, and you can reasonably get some farm damage done, as well as being early enough to combat earlier choppers without killing your economy completely. It allows you to start punishing super early aggression with a somewhat sustainable chopper production. And then it pretty simply and cleanly gives you that air force that you need in order to make a clean transition to vehicles and then play the vehicle late game. Nice, awesome, great, groovy, grand. And then finally, I have one more build to mention and this is again from early game to late game. The intention with these is to give you a general idea of ways that you can get from early game to late game and not hate your life, because late game is fun and I want you to tell me exactly the dynamics of why anti-air should be the most important late game unit. But in order for you to do that with any sort of experience backing that up, you need to actually make it to late game more than once. Okay, this next strat: militia jeep into tanks or choppers, with an emphasis on workers, and then into defense research. Okay, so this is going to be more complicated, and it is going to require a little bit more discipline in the early game. First things first, you can't up your CC. If you up your CC, you delay your first Jeep by a significant margin, and you start losing to early chopper. That's bad. You don't want that. Okay, so don't up your CC. That $50 is going to be important. The idea is, first your workers make 6 farms. While they're doing that, you queue 3 militia in your command center, so you can do that part from the start of the game. And then, after your workers are done making 6 farms total, alright, so 3 each, one of them comes back and makes a vehicle depot, and the other one goes out to get another farm. Once that depot is done, soon after you should be able to queue a Jeep. That Jeep will load up with 3 militia and start going and harassing. You'll then produce more militia as you go, and then you can just do a militia opener. You just happen to have a Jeep, which helps your militia move around quickly and helps them keep their fire on enemy farms, which is really important. Awesome. Cool. Great. So we've kind of gone over like the very beginning and now onward. So 4 houses, again, is going to be the important mark. That's partially because that's about the time when you have enough militia that you can sort of hold against militia aggression, and also partially because it's the time where you start having discretionary income you can spend. Okay, and I said tank or chopper. Tank's going to be a little easier. You already have the depot. Chopper, you're probably either going to have to sell the depot or you're going to have to buy a generator, but because of details that we'll go into in a little bit, you should be more able to do that than you think. Okay, After your 4 houses are done, no matter what, you make 2 workers. You make 2 workers. You're going to be destroying enemy farms with your jeeps. You need the workers to be able to take the farms more quickly. You have a lot of farms to be taking. Having the extra 2 workers just helps you out a lot. You can have 3 on the map, 1 at the base, 2 on the map, 2 at the base. Whatever it ends up being, you get the farm eco, which pays for itself in 75 seconds instead of in 4.5 minutes, like the houses do. Generally, just great idea. Once you're done housing, first priority is defense research to help chopper-proof your base and your farms, because you're going to have a lot of farms and you're going to need to be able to hold them, ideally. Okay, notes. Choppers are highly recommended for late game. That is an understatement. Drop an air pad before upgrading your depot. That is pretty much going to be the case for every single build you do. If you're upgrading your depot before you've dropped an air pad, you're just asking to lose. If for whatever reason choppers are not to be used, make fighters to give yourself more maneuverable and tank-proof anti-air. That's going to be a general rule of thumb. If for whatever reason you decide that you hate choppers and you're not using them, you need to use fighters, because otherwise you just kind of die to choppers, and also you get rolled by tanks. You don't need to be weak to both. Okay. Another point, militia jeep needs to hit early. So the first few minutes of this game will feel quite different to normal NRTS, but will provide you with greater ability to keep your guns firing at enemy farms while still enabling the massing of militia for defense. The early part is really important. If your militia jeep hits at 5 minutes, you're fighting like two chopper a minute production. That's just not going to work. The strength of the militia jeep is that you can get that thing out and running around at like a minute 10. With militia in it, and then you just continue your militia production. So the timing is pretty important, and so it's also important that you remind yourself, don't upgrade my command center. I'm only going to make a couple farms. I'm going to make the depot. I'm going to make the jeep. I'm going to trust in the process. I'm going to continually and slowly but continually expand my economy in terms of farms, and then we'll get back to where we're playing the normal NRTS I'm used to, where I'm just maxing eco. Okay. Another point, workers are more important here than they might otherwise be. Adding the 2 additional workers at 4 houses lets you build newly freed farms more quickly, speeding up economic expansion exponentially. If you find no great need for moving militia at more than 2 times their walk speed, workers actually benefit massively from hitching a ride in a jeep. Be sure to only keep 1 or 2 in a jeep at a time, though. That's another thing to point out. As the jeep is useful for keeping your malicious guns on a farm, jeeps are also useful for keeping your workers near a farm to be able to build farms, right? 2 workers can build farms decently quickly. The trouble is they have to walk between them. And so as you're moving around the map, you're spending a lot of time walking your workers and not a whole lot of time building. The jeep can help mitigate that significantly. Another thing here. Since militia jeep is going to be a very farm-heavy economy, you might find yourself more able to build static defenses than you otherwise would be, just because farms are pretty cheap for the eco that you get. You look at your eco, you're like, oh, I've got like 150 eco, but you will have had a pretty decent wallet. You can afford to be spending as you go, because you will have a lot more farms freed than your opponent on average. If you're going to go for a militia jeep opener, you just have better farm pressure than them, and you can take farms as you go. Right, you can sort of roll your opponent back. Okay, so cheap eco allows you to use static defenses, which can help you chopper-proof your economy. Choppers are going to be basically your enemy, no matter what. But in this case, especially if you're going to go into tanks afterwards, having the extra towers really helps out. And then defense research after max housing just doubles down on this principle, helping you to combat your otherwise crippling weakness to chopper medic. I think that's pretty simple. You will need to up your depot in order to win games. It's important that you ensure air units are no problem first. It's not a bad idea to even skip making light tanks altogether in favor of making choppers instead, hence tanks or choppers. Doing so will either require the selling of your depot or the construction of an additional generator, but the extra cost can be more than worthwhile to begin fighting a chopper war from a position of higher economy sooner. And that all has to deal with your extra farm pressure that you're going to get from putting militia on enemy farms. Final note in this build. It is significantly more delicate than the last one. Requires good game knowledge and responsible aggression. I'm going to emphasize responsible aggression. You can't just go and charge your units into the opponent and call it aggression. Try at your peril, though this might be the variety you seek in openers. Certainly, it can get you to the late game, and it can give you a crazy good late game. But you really, really need to be, like, on your micro. Not recommended for beginners. If you're feeling adventurous, go ahead and try it, though. Okay. And I'm afraid I have been yammering on for nearly an hour at this point, and it is 10:30 for me. How do I keep recording things at night? I really should stop that. In any case, ladies and gentlemen, if you've listened all the way to the end, I have no idea what's wrong with you. In all actuality, thank you very much for listening to the end. I hope that you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever it happens to be. I look forward to seeing you next week. And remember, stay classy.